quick show of hands here. How many of you have seeded a cover crop in your garden? Oh boy, quite a few of you. Kind of impressed. So for those of you that haven't, we'll get into why you would want to, and maybe those of you had, maybe we'll have a new species list that might be interesting to you guys. So before we even get into cover crops, we got to start right back at the soil, because that's the whole reason we're doing any of this. So what makes up a soil? Anybody? Any guesses? Air. I heard air. Yep, actually we're about 25% air, 25% water. Those two numbers interchange frequently. Depends on how much rain we get and how dry it is. So those two alternate. We actually have 45% mineral, which are your sand, silts, and clays. And then we also have 5% soil organic matter. So that'll be any of your dead litter, your biology, that all falls into that category of soil organic matter. What originally built our soils? So way back before Bismarck was ever a thought, this was just open hill prairie. And what did we have on that prairie? Large herds of bison, elk, deer, and a very diverse species of plants growing within the area. So in order to be more successful with our gardening, cover crops gives us that opportunity to mimic that diverse species mix. Because if we think about it, most of our gardens in nature, how often do you see corn naturally growing in a row, or brome grass, or anything? No, it's sporadic. So this gives us that nice opportunity to mimic nature and definitely give us some benefits. So now we're going to go back to high school for a lot of you and talk about the carbon cycle. So if we remember, for many years for some of us not so long ago, the carbon cycle is when animals respirate, CO2 is emitted into the atmosphere, plants take it in, they send it down into their roots. But when I say carbon, I want you guys to think food, because that's very important. That's what feeds our plants. So when I say carbon, I want you guys to think food. So I'll show you guys this picture here. So as you can see, this is a cornfield, and obviously you guys might not be egg producers, but we are gardeners, and this does apply. So a third of that carbon extracted off the landscape goes into the corn, the seeds itself. The other third is in the stem, and the last third's in the root system. So when we think about it, especially in our gardens, 2/3 of that carbon is extracted through the vegetables that we take off, and then at the end of our growing season, we clean up our gardens, correct? And then typically a lot of us will till it. So if you think about it, we're just mining our gardens. So if we plant cover crops, that gives us another opportunity to get those roots in the ground, get a live growing plant coming up. So it's just a really good opportunity to add covers, because some of those windy days, I know down 94 not so long ago, there was an accident because soil was blowing over the road. And granted, it might not be as extreme within a smaller garden. The same thing still happens, and all that phosphorus leaves. So if we add cover, it'll hold our phosphorus in place and just give us a good opportunity to also grow some roots, which builds water infiltration within our gardens as well. And if we remember from last year, it was dry. So, all right, another thing cover crops can give us, the opportunity that you want but you don't have, especially the cool season grass family. So if we think about what we typically plant within our gardens, it's usually broadleaves, right? We don't have any cool season grasses whatsoever that go in our gardens. We have warm season, which is corn, but when we have the cover crops, we add that ability to add a different species that our soils typically don't see. And when we add that, it builds different roots, and different root systems allow different things within the soil. You'll get different biology happening, and you'll also allow better infiltration of water. So here is one of the cover crops we did last year. We haven't seeded any of them, or any like this yet, because it's still a little warm out. But this is cereal rye. So cereal rye is a biennial plant, And what that means is you seed it in the fall and it will come back in the spring. So this is probably about 2 weeks after it was planted. And then this will be right before freeze up is what it looks like. And it just gives us good cover. And also another benefit of cereal rye is because it does come back in the spring, it will also start growing before we ever think that we want to get into our gardens. So typically around May, it'll start to green up and we still might have that last snowstorm. It might even green up earlier. So, and we might still have snow on the ground. It's still cold out, but that'll start waking up and start putting off liquid root exudates within the soil. So when we do a biennial, we just give ourselves a good opportunity. But when we also do biennial, okay. The other thing is when we do a biennial like cereal rye, we also have to desiccate it so it doesn't snuff out our gardens. So what we like to do, there's a couple different options. You can use herbicide, or what we like to do is we'll cover it with weed barrier, 2 layers for 10 days and smother it and take away the sunlight. And then when you pull that weed barrier, it'll be a little green for about a day and then it'll look just like this on this picture on the left. So a lot of people will see this and they'll think, well, okay, it's time to plant the garden. I got to till that under. Well, we don't here. What we do is we take a scissors, we cut a row, and then just pull back the roots a little bit so we can get good seed to soil contact within our rows. And we'll leave the residue there all year, and I'll have a slide later that shows that all that residue gets eaten by the biology. So this is actually the cover crop species of what you guys are taking home tonight. There's a variety of different ensembles you guys can put together. This is just what we happen to do for you guys. So we'll have cereal rye, sub or burst seam clover, sorghum sudan grass, cowpea, millet, soybean, and sunflower. So within that, we have a few different legumes. We have good deep taproots of the sunflower. We have some warm season grass, and we have some cool season grass. So it's just that diversity that we're shooting for, which was naturally here to begin with. So cover crops, used as green manure or compost. This is a term that actually I heard in my NDSU Master Gardener class, and I really liked it because it's just a good opportunity to actually add compost with not a lot of effort, and then we don't have to go through all the effort of composting. And as you can see, like I said, this will be a couple weeks after planting, and then if you look at the left, that's our beet bed to harvest. There's no residue left. The biology ate it all. So I'll move into just standard composting and a few different methods and materials. And for those of you that don't compost, this might be some good information to get into it. All right, so composting in your backyard. There's a million different ways to do it. There's a million different products you can buy, and there's probably a million different Pinterest ideas that you could do and put together for yourself. So, and to be honest, they all work. It just depends on your technique, but every single one of them will work, I promise. But here is probably more than likely static compost on the top. This guy right here. And then this will be like a Johnson Sioux bioreactor, also used for static compost. And then that'll be something that a lot of people use as a compost tumbler. These are expensive, but they're nice. It's a really easy way to turn your compost and get air into them. So let's visit a little bit about compostable material. So this is a good ratio to go by. You want about 75% carbon or brown materials to about 25% nitrogen. So for your carbon materials, there'll be dry leaves, dry straw, dry grass, chipped wood, shredded paper, coffee filters, sawdust, tea bags. And then for your greens, there'll be vegetable scraps, fruit peels. Try not to put much citrus in there. It's very acidic, so that can really affect the biology that's breaking down your compost. Coffee grounds, houseplants, spent flowers, manure from herbivores, plant prunings, fresh grass. I will caution you against this one. If you get it from somebody else, I would probably not use it because you do not know what they sprayed on their yard. I've heard a lot of horror stories where they'll go to the landfill, get the grass, and then it kills their tomatoes. So it's just something to be aware of, and you got to be cognizant of it. And what not to compost. Pet manure, that contains a lot of bad bacteria, and it's a good way to get E. coli into your garden, which we do not want. Meat, this one, honestly, you can compost it, but it depends on where you live. The biggest reason they say not to compost meat is because all it does is attract dogs, raccoons, things like that. And pretty much the same with dairy. Anything that gives that rotten smell, it'll attract unwanted animals. But there is a lot of articles on how to compost meat. All right, so troubleshooting our compost. How many people here have had issues with their compost piles? Oh yeah, there's definitely a few. So here's an easy way to troubleshoot it. If you have an odor, there's 3 causes. You have too much nitrogen, too much moisture, or a lack of oxygen. And luckily, we can fix these issues. So the easiest way to fix the nitrogen is just add more carbon because our ratio got out of whack. Moisture, open the pile and then add sawdust to soak up that moisture. Lack of oxygen, just turn the pile. This one, it smells terrible, and that typically means your pile went anaerobic, which means all your biology is dying. If your pile's too cool, a lack of nitrogen. Our piles, for those of you that don't know, should be between 150 degrees and 110. If they get below that 110, they are getting too cold. If they get above 150 degrees, you've got too much nitrogen, and then you also kill the biology when it gets too hot. So the key is to keep it in that nice, happy range. But if it gets too cool, like it says, a lack of nitrogen, so just add your green material back in. Lack of oxygen, just turn the pile, and that'll mix oxygen back into it. If it's got a lack of moisture, you need to dampen the pile. And if you got too much moisture, just add sawdust and mix the pile. And then if you have a dog digging in it, or it just smells bad or rancid, or you have raccoons, like I said, don't add meat or dairy, especially if you live in town, because you're just asking for a cranky neighbor. All right, so here's our compost piles out at Minokan Farm. You can actually see them. They're just on the other side of the high tunnel. When we get done here, if you guys want to go take a look. This has happened a couple of times. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has trapped carp, and we've added that to our compost pile. And like I said, our scenario is a little different. We don't live in town. We don't really have any neighbors, and if a dog or a coyote or something digs into our compost pile, it's not the end of the world because we have a 200-foot windrow of it. So like I said, it all depends on your situation. All right, so how many of us know when it's done? That's always a tough one. I get asked that one a lot. Well, there's a few different steps. The first test, I would say, is to simply look at it. If we don't see any of the material that we know we made it out of, that's probably a good sign saying, hey, we're really close. Another good test is to put a couple spoonfuls in a Ziploc bag and seal it for a couple days. When you open it and you smell it, if it's nice and earthy, that's another good sign it's done. And if you still don't trust yourself, you can go one step further and you can see a few cucumber seeds in it. Cucumbers are very sensitive and they germinate rather quickly. So if you have a good germination rate and a high number of what you planted, then more than likely it's ready to go. All right, so we'll go one step further. This is actually, we have this on the south side of the building. We have our Johnson Sioux bioreactors, which we water with rainwater. That's very important to the biology. If we use rainwater, then we don't have chlorine or chloramine that hinder it a little bit. And then we also have vermicompost bins, which some of you may know about. So we're going to talk about vermicomposting a little bit. We here don't do vermicomposting the traditional way. The traditional way is to start with some compost and add worms to it, and then you harvest the worm castings after a period of time. What we decided to do is we have these tanks. They're on a slope, so they're angled down, and then at the bottom we have hoses and buckets, and then we water across the top and collect what we call worm juice or vermicompost liquid extract, depending on how smart we need to sound that day. So with that, what's in the worm juice, there's literally not much nutrient whatsoever in it. But what we get from it is 5 phylum of fungi, 12 phylum of bacteria, which is approximately 370 species. We don't know if that's a lot. Sounds like a lot, but it's all kind of new to us anyways. So, but what we use it for inoculating all our seeds within the high tunnel. And what we do is we just soak all of our seeds before it plants. And then we'll also use it for foliar treatments. And if we have any fungus issues or things like that, we'll use foliar treatments for that too. And it really seems to help all our plants. And then we'll also use it if we have any insect issues like aphids. We'll mix molasses with it and then apply it to that plant. And it does suppress the aphids quite significantly. So, any questions? Yes?
So do you use the worm castings themselves, or you're just worried about the juice?
So eventually we will clean out the worm castings out of there after all the compost is gone. But no, right now we are concerned about collecting the juice because it's really easy to apply. And actually we use it in a lot of our our cropland fields just because the ag industry accepts liquid fertilizers and liquid willingly. So we utilize it everywhere on the farm, including our gardens and high tunnel. Yes?
How do you winterize your worm compost?
How do we winterize our worm compost? So actually, Jay tells the story best, but he's somehow magically gotten them hopelessly addicted to watermelon. So when it starts to freeze, what we do is we'll take watermelon, cut them in half, set them in these worm bins, and the next day we'll tip over the watermelon, and there will be worms everywhere. So we'll scoop them out, and then we'll put them in the Johnson Sioux bioreactors and move them into the building for the winter. Yes?
Your aphid treatment, do you spray it on?
Yes, actually we mixed it in a watering can and we just poured it over the plants. And don't quote me on this, this is just a theory, but what we think happens is when we add the molasses, it creates an artificial high Brix within the plants. And for those of you that don't know what Brix is, it's the sugar amount within that plant. And aphids can only withstand a certain amount of sugar. So that's why we think it suppresses them so much, is because there's too much sugar, so then it kills them. Yes? When do you plant cover crop? Great question. So the best time to plant a cover crop is after one of your plants decides that it's done for the year. So like right now, cucumbers are getting really close to being done. As soon as you pull out them cucumbers, seed cover crop right behind it. Well, it does vary, and sometimes it depends on when it freezes, or when we get snow. But the later you plant it, there is a chance that it won't come up, but it may come up the following spring as well. Any other questions?
How do you plant your cover crop?
So how do we plant our cover crops? We typically broadcast them across our beds and then scratch them in for a good seed to soil contact. And I will just say, for those of you that want to see a growing cover crop, we have a couple in the high tunnel right now, and we'll be over there. Jay will be over there, myself will be over there, and we can also go over the outdoor garden and stuff because we have milpa, which is just a gourded species cover crop. Yes?
Cover cropping like a raised garden bed on the patio, still recommended?
Absolutely. Anytime you can cover that soil. It is. Well, that makes it easier sometimes because then you can cover it to kill it and then you don't have to use a herbicide too. And the other thing it does is when you add a grass, that really builds the aggregates within your soil. So that's what makes the water infiltrate and go through your soils as well. Yes?
When I spread this on, like how thick does it go on?
Not very thick at all. We gave you quite a bit, so that could be used on a rather large garden. And if you want a good representation, we'll take you over in the high tunnel so then you can see it's growing, so then you have a rough idea of how thick to put it. Yes?
So like on your cucumbers, if your plants are not diseased or anything, do you recommend just leaving the vines until the spring?
So that varies too, because certain plants are very high in carbon, so they'll take a lot longer to break down as well. Because like if you've ever seen like last year's cornfield, you'll see, you know, stalk residue from maybe a year or 2 years ago. That's because it's very high in carbon. It takes a good long time to break down. So if you take it off, I would suggest put a cover crop on it so then we can get that plant growing. And then when you have a cover crop and you have a good species combination, it'll break down quickly because that's all within the carbon nitrogen ratio. Similar to compost, that's thought out when we put it in the cover crop as well, because when it goes to break down, that carbon nitrogen ratio still affects how fast those plants will break down in conjunction with each other. Any other, yes?
So between my carrot rows, can I put my cover crop in now, even though my carrots aren't gonna come out for a while?
Absolutely.
Composting over the winter, like if you have a tumbling composter,
Yes.
recommend like moving it back and just let it freeze and
It all depends on what you want to do. It doesn't hurt it if it freezes because it will start back up in the spring. But if you want to keep composting, or if you have like an active composter that you're actively adding to, then you could keep adding to it and don't have to worry about it freezing if you were to have it in a warm area as well.